Clara Whitmore planted both feet on the frozen ground of Red Hollow Ranch and did not move when the laughter started. She heard every word, every snicker, every low whistle from the men leaning against the fence post like she was some kind of traveling circus that had rolled into the wrong county. She stood there in the bitter Wyoming wind with one suitcase in her hand, and a grief so deep it had carved permanent lines around her eyes, and she did not flinch. She did not look down. She did not cry. She let them look. She had nothing left to lose, and somehow that made her the most dangerous woman any of them had ever underestimated. If this story already has your heart, I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel right now and follow Clara's story all the way to the end, because what happens next will stay with you long after you stop watching. And when you're done, leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to Red Hollow Ranch and to the widow they never saw coming. The wagon had barely rolled to a stop when Mason Reed crossed his arms and made up his mind. He was standing near the water trough with two other hands, Billy Crane and Holt Dawes, and all three of them watched Clara Whitmore climb down from that wagon with the kind of slow, deliberate movement that came from a woman who had learned not to rush herself through a world that was always watching and waiting for her to stumble. She was heavier than any woman they'd expected. That was the first thing Mason said, not loudly enough for her to hear, but loud enough for the men beside him to catch every syllable. Her dress was clean, but worn at the hem. Her chestnut hair was pinned back with no fuss and no vanity. Her face was round and soft, and deeply tired in a way that had nothing to do with the journey from Missouri, and everything to do with the 6 months she'd spent watching the man she loved die by inches in a sick room that smelled of medicine and lost hope. She carried one suitcase. It was not a large suitcase. Mason Reed saw all of that in the span of about 4 seconds and made his ruling the way men like him always did, fast, final, and without a single question asked. "Lord Almighty," he said under his breath. "Nathan hired us a widow who can't even lift her own heart off the floor." Billy Crane didn't laugh out loud. He just looked at the dirt and shook his head the way a man does when he's already decided something is a shame. Holt Dawes was more generous. He said nothing at all, which was its own kind of verdict. Clara heard the silence louder than any words. She always did. Nathan Callahan was already crossing the yard toward her, and she watched him come with the careful attention of a woman who had learned that first impressions told you almost everything you needed to know about a man's character. He walked straight and he walked fast, and he didn't put on a welcoming face that didn't belong there, that she respected. She had no patience left for false warmth after everything that had been taken from her. He was tall, lean in the way of a man who never stopped working. His hair was dark, going gray at the temples, and his jaw was set with the particular tension of someone carrying more weight than the eye could see. He had lost his wife 3 years ago. Clara knew that much from the letter. He had lost half his crew the winter before that. And now he was standing in front of a woman he had hired out of desperation, and she could see in the set of his mouth that he was already second-guessing every word of that letter he'd sent. He stopped a few feet in front of her and looked at her the way a man looks at a situation he isn't sure how to handle. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I'm Nathan Callahan." "I know who you are," Clara replied. "You wrote me a letter." "I did." He glanced down at her suitcase, then back up at her face. There was something behind his eyes, not unkindness exactly, but uncertainty, which was almost worse. "You understand the conditions here are rough." Clara turned and looked at the ranch with the slow, thorough attention of a woman taking inventory. She saw the broken fence line along the south pasture. She saw the smokehouse with the rotted boards near the base. She saw the way the storage shed door hung crooked on its hinges. She saw the hollow look in the cattle nearest the fence, the kind of hollow that didn't come from one bad week, but from months of mismanagement, building on top of more months of mismanagement until the whole thing was quietly collapsing from the inside. She turned back to Nathan Callahan. "I didn't come here for comfort," she said. "I came here to work." He studied her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not yet, but the uncertainty moved over a fraction of an inch and made room for something that might eventually become curiosity. "Kitchen's through there," he said, nodding toward the main house. "Crew takes meals at 6 noon and 6. Supplies are in the back storeroom. You'll find the inventory list on the shelf." Clara nodded. She picked up her suitcase. She walked toward the house. She did not look back at Mason Reed or Billy Crane or Holt Dawes. She didn't need to. She already knew what they thought of her. She'd been hearing that same opinion her entire life, delivered in 100 different ways by 100 different faces, and it had never once turned out to be the last word on the matter. The kitchen was worse than she expected, and exactly as bad as she'd prepared for. The stove had grease built up around the burners that had been there since at least last spring. The dry goods were stored without any system she could identify: flour next to lamp oil cornmeal in a sack that had been gnawed at one corner, dried beans mixed with what appeared to be 2 different grades of salt. The inventory list Nathan had mentioned was a piece of paper with numbers on it that bore almost no relationship to what was actually on the shelves. Clara set her suitcase down beside the narrow cot in the small room off the kitchen that would be hers. She sat on the edge of the cot. She pressed both hands flat against her knees. She gave herself exactly 3 minutes. She allowed herself to feel the full weight of where she was and what had brought her here. The empty house in Missouri, the debts that had eaten what little her husband had managed to leave her, the humiliation of having to write to a stranger in Wyoming and ask if she could cook his men's meals in exchange for a roof over her head. She let herself feel all of it because she had learned a long time ago that feelings you refused to feel had a way of choosing their own time to surface, usually at the worst possible moment. 3 minutes. Then she stood up. She tied on her apron. She walked back into that kitchen and she got to work. By the time the crew came in for the 6 o'clock meal, Clara had reorganized every shelf in the storeroom, identified 3 sacks of supplies that had gone bad and needed to be disposed of before they contaminated everything around them, repaired the gap in the corner flour bin with a piece of scrap wood she'd found near the door, and produced a meal that was hot and filling and had absolutely nothing to do with the sad biscuits and gray stew the men had apparently been surviving on for the last 2 weeks. She set the food on the table and stepped back to the counter. The men came in washed up at the basin and sat down. There was a moment of silence while they looked at what was in front of them. Mason Reed was the first one to speak. "What is this?" he said, not unkindly, but not with any warmth either. Just a statement that implied he was prepared to be disappointed. "Beef and root vegetable stew," Clara said, "with cornbread. There's dried apple pudding for after if anyone wants it." More silence. Then Billy Crane picked up his spoon because Billy Crane was 23 years old and had the priority system of a young man who hadn't eaten a real meal in longer than he cared to admit, and he tried it. His expression changed. "That's good," he said. And the surprise in his voice was so genuine that it almost made Clara smile, except that she also caught the look Mason Reed gave Billy, which was the look of a man who had already made up his mind and was mildly annoyed that the facts were not cooperating. Nathan Callahan came in last. He sat at the head of the table. He didn't say anything while he ate. He ate everything on his plate, and he didn't push the cornbread away like some of the men did when they weren't sure about it. When the meal was finished and the men started pushing back from the table, Clara was already clearing the plates. Nathan paused near the kitchen doorway. "Mrs. Whitmore?" She looked up. "Good meal," he said. 2 words. Flat delivery. The kind of compliment a man gives when he's surprised but doesn't want to make a production of it. Clara nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Callahan." He left. She washed the dishes alone in the lamplight and tried to remember the last time 2 words had felt like quite so much. The second day was when Mason Reed decided to make his position official. He came into the kitchen while she was kneading bread dough at 6 in the morning before the rest of the crew was up, and he stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and his hat on and his opinion written clearly across every line of his weathered face. "I want to speak plainly," he said. "Most people I've known who say that lead with the plainness pretty quick," Clara replied, not stopping what she was doing. "Go ahead. Nathan's a good man. This ranch has been through enough hard seasons without adding a charity case to the payroll. He said it without particular cruelty, the way a man states a thing he considers to be an obvious fact. You don't know cattle. You don't know fences. You don't know Wyoming winters. And no offense, ma'am, but you don't look like a woman who's built to survive what comes at us out here. Clara kept working the dough. She let him finish. She let the silence sit there between them for a few seconds before she looked up. You know what I've noticed about men who tell a woman what she isn't built for, she said. They spend so much time on that speech that they never get around to asking what she actually knows. Mason Reed's jaw tightened. I'm asking now, he said. No, you're not, Clara replied pleasantly. You're telling. There's a difference. She folded the dough over, once pressed it down. But I'll answer anyway. I know how to feed 14 men for 3 weeks on supplies that most people would give up on after 8 days. I know how to treat a wound before it turns septic, because I spent 2 years nursing a sick man with no doctor within 40 miles. I know how to stretch a winter store, and how to identify feed that's going to cost you half your cattle before the snow melts. She looked directly at him. And I know that the inventory list in your storeroom is off by about 30%, which means somebody has been either stealing or badly miscounting for the last several months, and either way that is a problem that needs to be addressed before the first hard freeze. Mason Reed stared at her. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He put his hat back on. It had slipped when he crossed his arms, and he walked out of the kitchen without another word. Clara watched him go. Then she turned back to her bread dough. She was not naive enough to think she had won anything. A man like Mason Reed didn't change his mind in the space of one kitchen conversation. What she had done was establish that she was not going to be managed. That was enough for now. The inventory discrepancy was real, and she brought it to Nathan that afternoon. He was in the barn working on a piece of harness when she came in, and he looked up with the expression of a man who expected to be asked for something minor, and was already calculating whether he could spare the time to deal with it. Clara laid the 2 sheets of paper on the workbench beside him, the original inventory list, and the count she had done herself that morning. These numbers don't match, she said. The original list shows 40 pounds more cornmeal than what's actually in the storeroom. It shows 12 more tins of salt pork. It shows a full barrel of lamp oil that is currently about a third full. Nathan set down the harness. He looked at both sheets. His expression went very still in the way that told Clara this was not new information he was receiving, but old information he was being forced to confront in writing. How long ago did you count this? He asked. This morning. How accurate are you? I was a school teacher's wife for 11 years, Clara said. I kept our household accounts for every single one of them. I don't make mistakes with numbers. Nathan's jaw worked. He picked up both sheets and looked at them again, then set them down. Mason does the inventory count, he said. I know, Clara replied. And she left the implication exactly where it was, because it wasn't her place to make accusations against a man who had worked this ranch for years, and she had enough enemies already without borrowing more. Nathan looked at her for a long moment. I'll look into it, he said. Clara nodded. She walked back toward the house. Behind her, she heard Nathan put down the harness with considerably more force than the task required. By the end of the first week, 2 things had happened. The first was that Billy Crane had quietly started asking Clara questions. Small ones at first, whether she knew a better way to store the root vegetables so they didn't go soft before February. Whether the pudding she'd made on Thursday had cinnamon in it. Because his mother used to make something similar, and it had been a long time since he'd tasted anything that reminded him of home. He asked these questions sideways, the way young men do when they want information, but don't want to look like they're asking for help, and Clara answered them the same way without making anything of it, which made Billy Crane trust her a little more each time. The second thing was that Nathan had a long conversation with Mason Reed that no one in the bunkhouse heard directly, but that everyone on the ranch understood had happened because Mason's manner toward Clara shifted from openly dismissive to carefully neutral, which was not warmth, but was at least the absence of active hostility. And for the time being, Clara would take it. She was walking the south fence line, On the 7th morning she had taken to walking the property at first light, learning the land, the way she had always learned difficult things by going slowly and paying attention when she found the section of fence that was about to fail. It was a long stretch near where the south pasture met the tree line, and the posts had been sinking for what looked like the better part of a season. The wire was still holding, but barely. One good wind, and Wyoming was not short of good winds, would bring the whole section down and push the cattle out into territory that had no reliable water source. Clara stood there in the cold morning light and looked at the fence for a long time. She didn't know how to repair a fence. She had been honest with Mason Reed about that. But she knew how to identify a problem before it became a disaster, and she knew that knowing where a problem was had value even if you couldn't fix it yourself. She went back to the house and found Nathan at the breakfast table. "The south fence is going to come down," she said. "The section near the tree line. I'd say you have a week, maybe 2 if the wind stays quiet." Nathan looked up from his coffee. "How do you know where the south fence line is?" he said. "You've been here a week." "I walk the property every morning," Clara said. "I like to know what I'm working with." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was starting to recognize, the one where he was recalculating something in his head that he'd already filed under a different category. "I'll send Holt out to look at it," he said. "The posts are sinking on the east end of that section too," Clara added. "About 30 yards in from the creek. You'll want to look at those first." He sent Holt out that afternoon. Holt came back and confirmed everything she'd said. That evening at supper, Holt Dawes looked at Clara from across the table with an expression that was the closest thing to respect she had seen from any of the ranch hands. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Clara understood that on a ranch actions spoke a language that went far deeper than compliments. But there was a moment late that first week when the dinner dishes were done, and the house was quiet, and the wind was starting to pick up that particular character. It got just before the weather changed, when Clara sat down on the edge of her cot in the small room off the kitchen and let herself feel the things she had been out running since she'd packed that one suitcase and climbed on the wagon. She was so tired. Not of the work she could do. The work was the part that made sense to her, the part that had always made sense, the feeling of problems becoming solutions and chaos becoming order under her hands. The work was the only thing that had kept her sane in the long months after Thomas died. What exhausted her was the effort of existing in a world that looked at her body before it looked at her, that had decided what she was capable of, before she'd opened her mouth, that required her to prove herself over and over and over again to people who wouldn't have demanded the same proof from a different kind of woman. She pressed her palms flat against her knees. She breathed. Outside, the wind came down off the mountain and moved through the yard with a sound like a long exhalation. Clara Whitmore was 32 years old, and she was sitting in a borrowed room in Wyoming with everything she owned in one suitcase and a grief she still hadn't found the bottom of. But she was still here. She was still working. And she had not asked a single person to believe in her. She had simply gone about the business of being worth believing in. The week ended. She was still there. She heard Mason Reed say something to Billy Crane the next morning that she wasn't supposed to hear. They were outside the kitchen window, and their voices carried on the cold air. "She made it a week," Billy said. There was surprise in his voice, genuine surprise, a pause. "Week ain't a winter," Mason Reed replied. But Clara noticed something in his voice that hadn't been there before. He didn't sound certain, and that, she thought as she turned back to the stove, and the morning biscuits, and the long work of another day, was something. That was the beginning. That was the thing that fear looked like in a man who had already started to understand, even if he wasn't ready to admit it, that the woman he'd counted out on the first day might be the one who counted for more than any of them had imagined. Clara kept cooking. Clara kept walking the land. Clara kept finding the problems before they became disasters. And deep in the Wyoming cold in the ranch that had given her nothing but skepticism and hard labor, something very quiet was beginning to take root in the cracked soil of Nathan Callahan's guarded heart, in the grudging eyes of men who had expected nothing from her. and in Clara herself, who had arrived with empty hands and grief in her bones, and was slowly, steadily, one morning walk, and one inventory count, and one perfectly seasoned pot of stew at a time, becoming exactly who she had always been. The woman they couldn't see. The woman they hadn't looked at long enough to know. The woman who, by the time the real winter came, would be the only reason any of them made it through at all. The second week began with a dead calf and an argument that nearly got Billy Crane fired. Clara heard it from the kitchen, the raised voices coming from the direction of the barn, sharp and fast. The way voices get when something has gone wrong, and everyone is deciding whose fault it is before anyone has taken the time to figure out what actually happened. She dried her hands on her apron and walked out into the cold morning air without being asked. Because, in her experience, arguments that loud at that hour of the morning were rarely about what they appeared to be about on the surface. Billy Crane was standing in front of the barn door with his fists at his sides and his face red in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Mason Reed was facing him with the particular stillness of an older man who has decided he doesn't need to raise his voice to win. Nathan stood between them with his arms crossed and an expression that said he was doing the math on how much more of this he had patience for. "I checked that calf last night," Billy was saying. "I checked her. She was fine." "Fine doesn't mean what you think it means," Mason said. "Fine means you looked and didn't see anything. That's not the same as fine. I know what I saw. You're 23 years old, and you know what you think you saw." "Both of you," Nathan said, and that was all he said, but the two words landed like a door closing. Clara moved past them into the barn. The calf was in the far stall already gone. She crouched down beside her, the way she had crouched beside her husband in the last weeks of his life, with the careful quietness of someone who understood that the only respectful response to death was to look at it honestly rather than look away. She examined the calf for a long moment. Then she stood up and walked back out. All three men were watching her. "She didn't die from neglect," Clara said. "She died from the feed. Look at the coloring around her mouth and the way her legs are positioned. That's not a calf that went down from cold or inattention. That's a calf that was already sick before she was born, because her mother has been eating compromised grain." Silence. Nathan looked at Mason. Mason looked at the ground. "Which batch of grain?" Nathan asked. "The batch in the third bin from the left in the storage barn," Clara said. "I flagged it in my inventory notes 5 days ago. I left the note on the kitchen table because I didn't know where else to put it." Nathan turned to Mason. "Did you see a note on the kitchen table?" Mason Reed said nothing for a moment that lasted slightly too long. "I may have moved it," he said finally. The silence that followed that sentence had weight to it. Nathan turned away from Mason without a word, which was, Clara understood, a far more serious response than any shouting would have been, and looked at her instead. "How many cattle have been eating from that bin?" "I can't say for certain," Clara replied. "But based on what I've seen of the rotation, I'd guess 8 to 12 of the breeding stock have been on that grain for at least 3 weeks. Nathan's jaw set. "Show me," he said. She showed him. They walked the storage barn together, just the two of them, and Clara went through everything she had documented, not just the compromised grain, but the 3 other issues she had identified and written down, and not yet found the right moment to raise, because she had been conscious since the first day that there was a difference between a woman who pointed out problems and a woman who came in the door already knowing everything, and that difference mattered enormously on a ranch where the men already doubted her. But the calf changed the calculation. "This salt pork," she said, stopping in front of a shelf. "It's still within date, but the seal on 4 of these tins is wrong. You can see it if you press here." She demonstrated. "A bad seal like that means the meat inside may have started turning. If your men eat from those tins, they could get badly sick." Nathan pressed the tin the way she'd shown him. His expression did something complicated. "And this," Clara said, moving to the next shelf. "The lamp oil. I mentioned the quantity discrepancy to you last week. But there's something else. The container it's stored in has a hairline crack along the base seam. In summer, that's a nuisance. In winter, when the metal contracts that crack opens up and you lose oil steadily. By February, you'd be short by enough to matter. Nathan stood in the storage barn and looked around it with the expression of a man who had just realized that the house he lived in had walls that were a great deal thinner than he'd thought. "How long did it take you to find all of this?" he said. "Most of it was in the first 3 days," Clara said honestly. "I've been waiting to understand the best way to tell you." He looked at her. "The best way," he repeated. "A man in your position doesn't generally appreciate a woman he hired last Tuesday telling him his ranch has been mismanaged," Clara said. "I was trying to be thoughtful about it." Something moved through Nathan Callahan's eyes, something that wasn't quite amusement, but was adjacent to it, and hadn't been there before. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said slowly, "from now on, I would appreciate it if you would tell me what you find as soon as you find it." Clara nodded. "Yes, sir," she said, "even if you think I won't want to hear it." "Especially then," she said. And there in the cold and the dim light of a barn that smelled of hay and feed, and the particular sadness of one small lost life, something shifted between them that wasn't friendship yet, and wasn't anything that either of them was going to name, but was something. A degree of trust placed deliberately like a stone set in a foundation that was still being built. They walked back to the house in the cold morning air, and neither of them said anything, and Clara thought about how some of the most important conversations she had ever had in her life had been the ones where almost no words were spoken at all. The thing about Mason Reed was that he wasn't a bad man. Clara understood this by the end of the second week, and understanding it made her situation considerably more complicated because it was much easier to dismiss the hostility of a bad man than to navigate the suspicion of a decent one who had simply made up his mind too fast and was now too proud to undo it cleanly. Mason had worked Red Hollow Ranch for 11 years. He had been there when Nathan's wife was alive. He had stayed through the hard seasons and the crew losses and the long grinding uncertainty of a ranch that was always one bad winter away from failing. He had made himself indispensable through sheer reliability and the kind of stubborn loyalty that was one of the most valuable things a man could offer an employer, and he knew it, and his identity was built on it in ways he probably couldn't have articulated if you asked him. Clara arriving was. She understood a threat that had nothing to do with her personally. She was evidence that Nathan needed help he hadn't been getting. And Mason Reed, who had told himself for 11 years that what he gave Nathan was enough, couldn't look at that evidence without feeling what it said about him. That didn't make his behavior acceptable, it just made it comprehensible. And comprehension, Clara had found, was the first step toward not letting another person's limitations become your own problem. She was thinking about this on a Wednesday afternoon, the Wednesday of the second week, cold and flat-skied, in the way Wyoming got, when it was drawing breath before something worse, when Holt Dawes appeared in the kitchen doorway. He stood there for a moment without saying anything, which was normal for Holt, who was a man of such extreme economy of speech that you sometimes forgot he had the capacity for it until he used it and surprised you. "There's a rider coming up the north road," he said. Clara looked up from the pot she was tending. "Nathan, no. Not yet. He's in the south pasture." "Who is it?" Holt was quiet for a moment. "Gerald Hatch," he said. The name meant nothing to Clara. But something in the way Holt said it, the careful flatness, the way his eyes didn't quite meet hers, told her the name meant a great deal to everyone else. "Go find Nathan," she said. Holt was already gone before she finished the sentence. Gerald Hatch arrived in a buggy that was too fine for the road he'd come up, and wearing a coat that cost more than most ranch hands made in 2 months. He was a broad man, with a broad smile, and the particular kind of confidence that Clara had learned to recognize the confidence of someone who had never been told no in a context that cost him anything. He stepped down from his buggy and looked around the yard with a proprietary air that immediately raised every instinct Clara possessed. She came out to the porch. He looked at her with the practiced amiability of a man who was very good at looking at women who were in his way. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said. "Gerald Hatch. I have business with Nathan Callahan." "Mr. Callahan is on the property," Clara said. "He'll be along shortly. Can I ask the nature of your business?" The smile stayed on Gerald Hatch's face, but something behind his eyes went slightly cooler. "Ranch business," he said pleasantly. "Between Mr. Callahan and myself." "Of course," Clara said in the same pleasant tone. "Would you like to come in and wait?" She showed him to the front room and gave him coffee and watched him while he looked around the house with the slow, cataloging attention of a man taking stock of an asset, not a guest. He looked at the furniture. He looked at the window. He looked at everything except Clara. She went back to the kitchen. She kept her ears sharp. Nathan came in through the back 20 minutes later, and Clara intercepted him before he reached the front room. She spoke low and fast. "Man named Gerald Hatch is waiting for you in the front room. He came in a fine buggy and a city coat, and he looked around your house the way a buyer looks at property he's already mentally purchased." Nathan's face did something. "Hatch," he said, and the word sounded like something he'd been expecting and dreading in equal measure. "You know him. I know of him." Nathan squared his shoulders in a way that told Clara he was preparing for something. "He's been buying up land in this county for 2 years, smaller ranches mostly, the ones that have had bad seasons. And he's come here. He's come here before." Nathan looked at her. "He made an offer last spring. I told him no. And now he's back. Apparently." Clara looked at him steadily. "What does he want with Red Hollow Ranch?" Nathan's jaw was tight. "Water rights," he said. "This land sits on the best water source in the county. The creek that runs through the south pasture feeds 3 other properties downstream. Whoever controls this land controls the water." Clara absorbed that. "And if you sell to him," she said slowly, "the downstream properties have to deal with Hatch directly," Nathan said. "And Hatch's terms are not what I'd call generous." He straightened his jacket and moved toward the front room, and Clara stepped aside to let him through. But she stayed within hearing distance. Not because she was the kind of woman who eavesdropped, but because she was the kind of woman who understood that information was the only currency available to people who didn't have money or power, and she was already very sure that whatever Gerald Hatch had come here to say was going to have consequences for everyone on this ranch, including her. The conversation was polite on the surface and brutal underneath. She heard it all. Hatch's offer was higher than the one he'd made last spring. He framed it as generosity. He talked about Nathan's recent difficulties, the crew losses, the hard winter, the challenges of operating a ranch of this scale with limited resources, with the sympathetic fluency of a man who had researched exactly where the pressure points were before he walked through the door. And Nathan said no. He said it clearly, without elaboration, without apology. Hatch's smile, even from the kitchen, Clara could hear losing its warmth by degrees. "I think you might want to consider more carefully, Nathan," he said, and dropped the Mr. Callahan, which told Clara exactly how the mask was slipping. "A ranch in your situation with winter coming on, these aren't easy conditions to survive, and my offer won't be on the table indefinitely." "I appreciate you coming out," Nathan said. "The answer is no." There was a pause. "I heard you brought on a new cook," Hatch said, and the change of subject was so deliberate and so precisely aimed that Clara felt it from the next room, like a cold finger touching the back of her neck. "A widow from Missouri." "I have," Nathan said. His voice was very even. "Interesting decision," Hatch said. "Man in your position stretched as thin as you are, taking on an additional dependent." "Mrs. Whitmore is an employee," Nathan said, "not a dependent." "Of course," Hatch said, and his tone said something entirely different from his words. The front door opened and closed. Clara heard the buggy moving out of the yard. Nathan came back into the kitchen. He stopped in the middle of the floor and stood there for a moment with his hands at his sides and his expression, the particular closed, tight look of a man who is holding something in that he doesn't have a safe place to put. "He'll come back," Clara said. "He always does," Nathan replied. "He's not just trying to buy the ranch," she said. "He already believes he's going to get it. The only question he's working on is the timing." Nathan looked at her. "How do you know that?" Because he talked about you like your decision was already made, and he just hadn't told you yet, Clara said. Men like that don't come calling twice unless they're certain. She paused. What does he know about your finances? The look Nathan gave her was one she'd seen before, the look of a person who had not expected the question that was just asked of them, not because it wasn't the right question, but because they hadn't thought someone else would think to ask it. More than he should, he said finally. Then someone is talking to him. Nathan was quiet for a long moment. That, he said slowly, is not something I want to believe. I know, Clara said, but not wanting to believe something has never once made it untrue. She turned back to the stove. She heard Nathan standing there behind her for another long moment, thinking she imagined the kinds of thoughts that were heavy enough to need standing room, and then she heard him walk back out. That night at supper, Clara watched the table. She watched Mason Reed eat his food with the focused attention of a man who was working to keep his eyes away from something. She watched Billy Crane talk too much in the easy way of someone who didn't know what tension was in the room. She watched Holt Dawes say nothing, which was normal, but with a quality of stillness to it that felt different from his usual quiet. She didn't know which one of them it was. She wasn't even certain it was one of them. But the feeling she had carried all her life, the feeling of reading rooms of knowing when a smile didn't reach a person's eyes, of understanding the difference between a man who was simply private and a man who was hiding something. That feeling had her attention, and she had learned a long time ago to trust it. She slept poorly that night. She was up before 4 a.m, which was before even her usual hour, and she was in the kitchen with the lamp turned low when she heard the sound. It was outside, soft. Not the sound of an animal she knew. Those by now, the horses shifting the cattle, settling the particular nocturnal vocabulary of a ranch at rest. This was the sound of a person moving deliberately and quietly, which was a sound that had no innocent explanation at 4 a.m. Clara stood very still beside the kitchen window without moving the curtain. She waited. The sound came again from the direction of the storage barn. She pulled on her coat and her boots, and she went out. She told herself afterward that it was a foolish thing to do, going out alone in the dark at 4 a.m. toward a sound she couldn't identify. She acknowledged that. But the truth was that in the moment she didn't weigh it as a risk. She weighed it as information she needed and couldn't get from inside the house. The storage barn door was open by an inch. It was always latched at night. Clara pushed it open slowly. The lamp inside was turned so low it was almost out, but it was enough to see by, and what she saw was Mason Reed standing in front of the third shelf with a piece of paper in his hand and an expression on his face that collapsed into something she'd never seen there before when he heard her come in. Not anger, guilt. Clara looked at him. He looked at her. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "What are you doing, Mr. Reed?" The paper in his hand shook slightly. He stopped. He looked at the paper, then back at her. "I'm checking the inventory." At 4 a.m, Clara said. Not as an accusation. As a simple observation offered with the same calm, she offered everything. Mason Reed was quiet for a very long time. When he spoke again, his voice had changed entirely. The authority had gone out of it. What was left was something much older and much more tired. "I borrowed money," he said. Clara waited. 3 years ago, after Nathan's wife died. The ranch was struggling, and Nathan wasn't himself for a long time after Eliza died. He wasn't watching things the way he should have been, and I started handling more, and I needed money for something personal, and He stopped. "It wasn't supposed to be permanent. I was going to put it back." "But you didn't," Clara said. "No," Mason said. "I didn't." "And Gerald Hatch." The name hit Mason like a stone to the glass. He went very still. "He found out," Mason said at last. "He came to me 8 months ago, said he knew about the missing supplies. Said if I didn't..." He stopped. He looked at the floor. He wanted information about the ranch finances, about Nathan's debts, about anything that would help him make his case for purchase. Clara stood in the storage barn in the lamplight at 4 in the morning and looked at a man who had worked faithfully for 11 years and then spent 3 of them making one mistake larger and larger until it had gotten hold of someone else's hand. "Does Nathan know?" she said. "No. He needs to know." Mason's head came up. "It'll finish me here," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "It probably will." He stared at her. "Then why?" "Because Gerald Hatch knows exactly what this ranch's weaknesses are and exactly when to push on them," Clara said. "And he will keep pushing until he gets what he wants, or until Nathan understands what he's dealing with. And Nathan cannot defend something he doesn't know is under attack." She looked at Mason steadily. "I'm sorry for what it costs you. I truly am. But the cost of Nathan not knowing is higher than the cost of him knowing." The silence stretched out between them. Mason Reed's whole body seemed to diminish slightly, the way a structure does when a key support is removed. "He'll send me away," he said. "Maybe," Clara said. "Or maybe he'll be angry and hurt, and then he'll remember 11 years of a man who showed up every day and did the work, and he'll find a way through it. I don't know. I can't tell you what Nathan will do." She paused. "But I can tell you that if you keep this from him, and Hatch comes back and pushes harder, and Nathan loses this ranch because he didn't know what was coming, you won't recover from that. Not inside yourself." Mason Reed didn't answer for a long time. He folded the piece of paper in his hands with the careful mechanical movements of a man who needed something to do with his hands, while the rest of him was occupied with something enormous. He put the paper in his pocket. He looked at Clara. "You could have gone straight to Nathan with this," he said. "Yes," Clara agreed. "Why didn't you—" Clara pulled her coat tighter against the cold. "Because I've been the person someone went around instead of talking to," she said quietly. "It's not a good feeling. And because you're not a bad man, Mr. Reed. You made a bad mistake, and you made it worse by letting someone else use it against you. Those are 2 different things from being bad, and I think you know the difference even if you've been having trouble seeing it." Mason Reed looked at her for a long moment. Then he put his hat on. He walked past her toward the door. He stopped. "In the morning," he said without turning around. "I'll talk to him in the morning." "All right," Clara said. He went out. Clara stood alone in the storage barn in the lamplight for a few minutes after he was gone, just breathing and letting the stillness settle around her. And she thought about Thomas, who had always said that the hardest conversations were the only ones worth having. She thought he was right about that more often than she wanted to admit. She went back inside. She did not sleep. By the time the sky started going gray in the east, she had coffee on, and biscuits in the oven, and the table set for the day. And when Nathan came in at his usual hour, and poured himself a cup, and stood at the window looking at the morning, she didn't say anything about Mason Reed or Gerald Hatch, or what had happened in the storage barn. She let the morning be what it was for a few more minutes. Because Mason kept his word. At 7 in the morning, Clara heard the low murmur of voices from Nathan's office. Mason's voice first rougher than usual, and losing its steadiness in places, and then Nathan's, which was very quiet, and then went quieter still, in the way that a voice does when the person behind it has stopped performing composure and is simply sitting with what they've just been told. It went on for a long time. Clara took the biscuits out of the oven. She put them on the table. She sent Billy Crane in with coffee for both men and told him not to knock. When Nathan came out of the office 2 hours later, his face was the face of a man who had just set down something very heavy and didn't yet know how to walk without the weight of it. He came into the kitchen and stood at the counter. "You knew," he said. "It wasn't an accusation." "Since 4 this morning," Clara said. "You could have come straight to me." "I could have," she said. "I thought he should have the chance to do it himself." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "He took those supplies to cover a debt," Nathan said. 11 years of straight work and he stopped. "It doesn't cancel the 11 years, Clara said. Nathan looked at her. "No," he said slowly. "It doesn't." He set his coffee cup down. "Hatch has been leveraging this for 8 months. 8 months, Clara. It was the first time he had used her given name. Neither of them mentioned it, but it was there between them, like the first stone of something being laid. "He'll come back," Clara said. "And now that Mason has told you, Hatch has lost his leverage over Mason, so he'll come at you from another direction." "I know," Nathan said. "What are you going to do about Mason?" Nathan looked at his hands. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "I'm angry. I won't pretend I'm not, but He stopped. "He worked this ranch when I couldn't. After Eliza died. There were months where Mason Reed was the only reason this place didn't fall completely apart." Clara said nothing. She let Nathan sit with it. "I'll need some time," he said. "That's all right," she said. "Time is reasonable." He picked his cup back up. He stood at the counter for another moment. "The water rights," he said. "If Hatch gets this ranch, what happens to the downstream properties?" "They deal with Hatch," Clara said. "On his terms." "The Pelton family is downstream," Nathan said. "George Pelton has 3 children and a wife who's not been well. He can barely keep up with what he owes now." "Then it's not just your ranch you're defending," Clara said. "It never was," Nathan said. He said it quietly, like something he'd known for a long time, but hadn't said out loud in a while. He set down his cup. "I need to ride out," he said. "I need to think." "I'll save you a plate," Clara said. He nodded. He went out. Clara stood in the kitchen and looked at the space where he'd been standing and thought about the word he'd used. Her name. Just her name, plain and simple, but said in a voice that had none of the careful professional distance in it that he'd maintained since the first day. She turned back to the stove. She told herself it meant nothing. She was a very intelligent woman, and she was not always right about the things she told herself. But she was also pragmatic enough to know that even if it meant something, she was standing in a kitchen in Wyoming in the second week of a job she was still not entirely sure she would keep, with a grief that hadn't fully let her go yet, and a ranch that was under financial threat she didn't fully understand, and the appropriate response to all of that was not to invest hope in the sound of one man saying her name. The appropriate response was to make sure there was enough food put by to last through whatever was coming. She pulled out her inventory sheets. She got to work. The second week ended with the sky doing something that every longtime Wyoming resident could read like a sentence, and that Clara had started to learn herself: a thickening in the air, a particular quality of silence that had pressure behind it. A way the cold settled that felt less like temperature and more like intention. Billy Crane said it over supper, saying what everyone was already thinking. "Snow's coming early this year," he said. Holt Dawes nodded once. Mason Reed said nothing. He had been very quiet since the morning, a different kind of quiet from his usual authority. He sat at the table and ate what was in front of him, and didn't make eye contact with anyone, and Clara watched Nathan watching Mason with the complicated expression of a man who hadn't yet decided what he was going to do with what he now knew, and she thought about how the hardest part of being a decent person was that it required you to hold pain and fairness in the same hand at the same time. After supper, as she was clearing the dishes, she heard Nathan in the doorway. "The south fence Holt repaired," he said. "I walked it today. Good work." "He does good work," Clara agreed. "I also checked the third feed bin." A pause. "The grain that killed the calf. I separated out the rest of the stock from that bin today. 2 more animals were starting to show signs." "How are they?" Clara said. "They'll recover," Nathan said, "because you caught it before it went further." She kept her back to him, kept her hands in the wash water. "I'm glad," she said. "Mrs. Whitmore." She turned. He was standing in the doorway with the lamp behind him and his hat in his hand, not in the formal way, not the way men held their hats when they were being polite, but loosely. The way a man holds something when he's forgotten he's holding it because his mind is fully occupied elsewhere. "I owe you a more direct acknowledgement than I've been giving you," he said. Clara waited. "You have been running this ranch from the inside," he said, "since the day you arrived, and I have been too stubborn and too distracted and too much inside my own problems to tell you that clearly." His jaw worked. "This ranch is still standing because of the things you found. The grain, the fence, the salt pork. If any one of those had gone another 2 weeks without being caught. "Mr. Callahan," Clara said. "Nathan," he said. She held his gaze. "Thank you for saying that," she said quietly. "It matters to me more than you probably know." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he put his hat back on. "First, hard snow will be here in 3 days," he said. 4 at the outside. I want to walk the full property with you tomorrow, if you're willing. Everything you've seen that I haven't." "I'd be glad to," Clara said. He nodded. He went out. Clara turned back to the dishes. Outside, the sky was the color of a bruise going gray, and the wind coming down off the mountain had a new sound in it, a sound that winter made when it was no longer on its way, but had arrived, was standing just beyond the tree line, was waiting for exactly the right moment to come through. 3 days, Nathan had said. 4 at the outside. Clara looked at her inventory sheets drying on the counter. She thought about every supply she had found and fixed and protected. She thought about everything she hadn't found yet. She thought about Gerald Hatch and the things he knew and the things he was going to do with what he knew when he came back. She blew out the lamp. She stood in the dark kitchen with the Wyoming cold pressing against the walls, and she felt the particular feeling that she had learned over the course of a very hard life to take seriously. The feeling that everything that had happened so far, everything that had tested her and stretched her and required her to be more than anyone expected had been practice. What was coming was not practice. She went to bed. She did not sleep well, but she was ready. The walk Nathan had promised happened at first light, and it changed everything. Not because of what they saw, but because of what they said to each other while they were walking, which was the kind of talking that only happens between 2 people who are moving side by side in the cold, with a common purpose and no audience and no performance required of either of them. They started at the north boundary and moved south, and Clara talked and Nathan listened, which was a reversal of the dynamic she had lived with her entire adult life. And she felt the strangeness of it, even as she recognized that this was simply what it felt like to be taken seriously by someone who had the power to act on what you told them. She showed him the feed rotation she had restructured. She showed him the smokehouse repair she had made to the south wall. She showed him the section of roof on the storage barn that had new weakness along the ridge beam. Not enough to fail in normal conditions, but in a heavy snow load, it would be the first place to give. "I would have that reinforced before the storm hits," she said. "If you have the lumber." "I have the lumber," Nathan said. He was walking beside her with his hat pulled low and his hands in his coat pockets, and he was listening with the full body attention of a man who had decided that what he was hearing mattered more than anything else, currently competing for his time. "What else?" "The cattle in the east pasture are thinner than the ones in the west pasture," Clara said. "Same feed, same water source, which means it's not feed and it's not water. It's stress. Something is disturbing them regularly on the east side." Nathan stopped walking. "What kind of disturbance?" "I don't know yet," Clara said, "but it's consistent enough to affect their condition over several weeks, which means it's not random. Something is happening over there on a regular basis." Nathan looked toward the east pasture for a long moment. "Rider comes through there," he said slowly. "I've seen the tracks. Assumed it was someone taking a shortcut from the north road." "What's on the north road?" Clara said. "About 4 miles out." He paused. "The Hatch property." They looked at each other. "He's been running riders through my east pasture," Nathan said. The sentence started even and went flat at the end with a controlled anger that Clara recognized as more dangerous than shouting. "Regularly enough to stress the cattle," she said, "which means he's been watching, learning the rhythms of this ranch, understanding exactly how you operate and where the pressure points are." Nathan turned and looked back toward the house. "He knew about Mason," he said. "He knew about the missing supplies. He knew about my finances." The words came out slow and deliberate, like a man rebuilding something in his head that he thought he'd understood. "He didn't just happen to know those things." "No," Clara said. "He didn't." "He's been building a picture," Nathan said. "For months, maybe longer. And he was going to use that picture," Clara said, to make you feel like you were already losing before he ever made his final offer. Nathan's jaw tightened in the particular way she had learned meant he was holding back something that he hadn't yet decided what to do with. "How do you know how men like that operate?" he asked. Clara looked at the east pasture. "My husband was sick for 2 years," she said. "And while he was sick and I was caring for him, a man came and bought our debt from the bank and held it over us very quietly and very patiently until Thomas died. Then he presented me with terms that left me with nothing." She said it without self-pity, because she had long since moved through the self-pity stage and come out the other side into something cleaner and harder. Different man, same method. Nathan was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry," he said. "I learned from it," Clara said, "which is the only useful thing you can do with something like that." They walked back toward the house in the cold morning air, and the silence between them was different from the silence of the first days, less distance in it, more of the particular quality of quiet that exists between people who have shared something real. The storm came in 2 days, not 3. Wyoming was like that. It didn't consult the predictions it had allowed people to make. Clara was in the kitchen at 5 in the morning when she felt the pressure change, not heard it, felt it. The way the air in the house shifted from cold to something with an edge to it that meant business. She went to the window and looked out at the sky, and what she saw made her go immediately to the back door and call out with a voice loud enough to reach the bunkhouse. "It's moving faster!" she called out. "Everybody up!" She didn't wait to see if they heard her. She went straight to the storeroom. She had been preparing for this for 3 days, not secretly but quietly, in the way she did everything, working through the logic of what a hard storm would require, and positioning what they had to meet it. The livestock feed was already sorted and separated into daily allotments. The provisions for the house were organized by priority. The medical supplies, such as they were, a limited kit that she had supplemented with everything she knew how to improvise, were in a box on the second shelf where she could reach them fast. What she had not prepared for was the speed. The first real snow hit at 6:30 in the morning, and by 7 it was not a storm so much as a wall. Nathan got the cattle into the shelter pens in time barely. Holt and Billy reinforced the storage barn roof with the lumber. Nathan had had them pull the previous afternoon, Clara's suggestion now standing between them and a very bad problem. Mason Reed, who had been quieter than usual since his conversation with Nathan, but had not been sent away and had not stopped working, took charge of the heating system in the bunkhouse with the focused efficiency of a man who needed to prove something to himself, and was using the emergency to do it. And Clara ran the house. She ran it the way she had run everything in her life that needed running, without drama, without waiting for someone to tell her what to do next, moving from problem to problem with the internal compass of a person who has spent a lifetime understanding that in a crisis, the most important thing you can be is useful. The first crisis was water. The well pump froze by 8 in the morning, faster than Nathan had expected, and the look on his face when he came in to tell her said clearly that he was doing calculations in his head and the numbers were coming up short. "How much do we have stored?" he said. 40 gallons in the kitchen," Clara said. "Another 60 in the storage room in sealed barrels. I put them there 3 days ago." He stared at her. "You stored water," he said. "I stored water," she confirmed. A beat. "How did you know the pump would freeze?" "I didn't," Clara said. "I knew we were about to have a hard storm, and water was going to be either a problem or not a problem, and making it not a problem cost me 2 hours and 40 barrels, so it seemed worth doing." Nathan looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not just respect, not just gratitude, but something closer to wonder, the look of a man who was encountering something that genuinely exceeded his expectations in a life that had given him limited practice at being surprised in good ways. "What else did you do that I don't know about?" he said. Clara thought about it. "The spare lamp oil is in the root cellar where the temperature is stable," she said. "The extra blankets from the storage chest in the east room are in the bunkhouse. The medicinal kit is fully stocked. I traded 4 jars of the preserved tomatoes to Mrs. Garrett in town last week for a proper supply of carbolic and clean bandaging. The food is rationed to last 16 days at current head count, or 22 if we move to 2 meals instead of 3. Nathan said nothing for a moment. 22 days, he said. If necessary, Clara said. Wyoming storms don't typically run 22 days. No, Clara said, but if this one runs 10, and you've only planned for 8, the difference between those two numbers is the difference between managing and not managing. He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. Then Billy Crane burst through the back door with snow on his coat and an expression on his face that immediately told Clara the morning was about to get more complicated. One of the cattle pens is leaking, he said, breathing hard. The south corner. The wind found the gap in the boards, and it's driving snow straight in on the animals. Nathan moved immediately. Clara caught his arm. It was the first time she had ever touched him, and she felt him go still at it. And she kept her hand there for exactly 1 second, enough to make him look at her. You can't go out in that wind without someone on a line, she said. I need to secure that pen. I know, she said. And you will. But you'll take a rope tied to the fence post before you take 1 step into that wind. She met his eyes. I am not pulling a dead man out of a snowdrift, Nathan. The second time his name had come from her mouth. Different circumstances from the first. More weight to it. He felt that weight, and so did she. Holt, he called out. Holt Dawes was already in the doorway with a coil of rope. They went out. Clara stood at the window and watched the rope go taut in the white, and felt something she hadn't let herself feel since Thomas died, which was the particular terror of caring whether a specific person came back. She turned away from the window. She went back to work. The pen was secured. Nathan came back in 20 minutes later with snow in his hair and his hands red with cold. And Clara was there with hot coffee before he'd finished getting his coat off, and neither of them made anything of it. But the ease of it, the naturalness of her being there, with the thing he needed before he'd asked, was the kind of thing that settled into a relationship without being announced. By noon, the storm had reached the kind of ferocity that made it clear this was not going to be a one-day event. By 2 in the afternoon, the temperature inside the bunkhouse had dropped enough that Mason Reed came to the main house and told Nathan without any of his usual pride in the way that the heating system was losing the battle. We can't keep it warm enough for the men to sleep safely, he said. Nathan looked at Clara. Clara had already thought about this. Everyone sleeps in the main house tonight, she said. The front room and the kitchen. We consolidate the heat source and we keep everyone together. Mason looked at her. That's your house, he said. It's Nathan's house, she said. And he'd say the same thing I'm saying, wouldn't you? It wasn't a question. Nathan said, move them in. What happened over the next several hours was the kind of enforced proximity that stripped away the formal distances that people maintained between themselves in ordinary circumstances. The main house was not large. 7 men, Nathan Mason, Billy Holt, and 3 other hands Clara had been feeding, but hadn't yet had extended conversation with, crowded into the front room and kitchen with their bedrolls and their tired faces and their cold hands, and Clara fed them from the stores she had laid in and kept the fire going and moved through it all with the calm practicality of a woman who had spent a large portion of her adult life making limited space work for more people than it was designed to hold. Sometime around 9 in the evening, Billy Crane said, Mrs. Whitmore, how'd you know to store all this food ahead? Clara was ladling stew into bowls at the stove. I've been cold before, she said. And hungry. And without what I needed because I didn't plan. You learn. You've been through a bad winter before, Billy asked. I've been through bad winters, Clara said. And bad years. And bad... She paused. A lot of bad things. You learn from all of them, or you don't. And if you don't, you tend to go through the same bad things again. Billy thought about that. My ma used to say something like that, he said. Smart woman, Clara said. She handed him his bowl. He looked at it and then looked at her. I'm sorry, he said, for the first week. When we don't, Clara said. He blinked. I don't need the apology, she said, not harshly. I need you to eat your supper and get some sleep, and be ready to work in the morning. That's what I need from you, Billy. He nodded. He ate his supper. Holt Dawes was leaning against the wall near the back of the room, and Clara caught him watching her with the expression he sometimes got, not unfriendly, but very intent, like a man trying to solve a problem he hasn't fully articulated yet. What? She said quietly, passing near him. Nothing, he said. Then, you remind me of my grandmother. Clara raised an eyebrow. She was a tall, thin Cherokee woman, Holt said. Then I remind you of her in spirit, Clara said dryly. Something happened to Holt's face that might have been a smile. It was hard to tell with Holt. But she thought it was a smile. It was close to midnight when the sound came. It was different from the storm sounds they had all been living inside for 16 hours. The storm had its own rhythm and its own language by now, and this sound was outside that language, wrong in the specific way that cuts through exhaustion and reaches the brain before the conscious mind has finished deciding whether to pay attention. Clara heard it first. She sat up on the bedroll she had laid in the kitchen corner, and she listened. Cattle. But not the normal distress of animals in a hard storm. This was a different sound. A panicked sound. The kind of sound that spoke of injury, not just discomfort. She was on her feet before anyone else in the room had moved. She crossed to where Nathan was sleeping and put her hand on his shoulder. He was awake instantly, the way men who had spent years running a ranch were awake from nothing to full alert with no transition. East Cattle Pen, Clara said. Something's wrong. He heard what she heard. He was up. He woke Holt. And then came the thing that shifted everything. The thing Clara did not plan and did not deliberate about, and would not have been able to fully explain afterward, which was that she put on her coat and her boots, and she picked up the second rope coiled by the door, and she went out with them. Holt took the lead rope. Nathan looked at her. You should stay inside, he said. Someone should, Clara agreed. But Billy's in there and Mason and the other men, and they don't need a person to stay. You need a second set of hands out here. Nathan looked at her for 1 second in the howling dark. Then he nodded. They moved in a line, Holt first, then Nathan, then Clara, the ropes linking them to each other and to the fence post behind them, and the wind was a physical thing, a live thing, pressing against them with the mindless force of something that didn't know they were there and wouldn't have moved if it did. The East Pen was in chaos. The gate had blown, not broken, but the latch had failed, and half the cattle had moved out into the area between pens, and in the crowding and confusion in the dark and the noise one animal had gone down. She was a large cow, one of the breeding stock, and she had gone down on her side, and the others were moving around her, and it was only a matter of time before she was trampled. Nathan went for the gate. Holt went for the cattle closest to the downed animal. Clara went for the animal herself. She moved through the cattle the way she had learned to move through difficult things, not fighting the resistance, not stopping because of it, but finding the lines through it, the way water finds lines through rock. She got to the cow and got her hand on the animal's neck and spoke to her low and steady, the kind of voice that was less about words and more about a frequency that said, I am here and I am calm, and you are not alone. The cow struggled. Clara held on. She was not a small woman, and she had strength in her that most people who looked at her had never thought to consider, and she used it now. She kept her hand on the animal's neck, and she talked to her, and she stayed down in the snow and the dark and the wind, and she waited. The cattle around them began to settle, not because anything had been resolved, but because Clara had not moved and had not panicked. And panicking animals take their cues from what is around them, same as people do. Nathan got the gate reset. Holt moved the cattle back through. Between the two of them, and Clara still on the ground with her hand on the downed cow, they got the pen reorganized in 23 minutes that felt significantly longer. The cow got up. She was unsteady, but she was up. Clara stood up. She was covered in snow and considerably less clean than she had started the evening, and she was breathing hard with the cold and the effort. And when Nathan reached her and put his hand on her arm to steady her, She let him, which was something she had not let anyone do for a very long time. "You all right?" he said. "I'm fine," she said. "Is she going to be all right?" He looked at the cow now standing at the back of the pen. "Yes," he said. "Thanks to you." Clara started back toward the house. Nathan walked beside her, and the rope still connected them, and neither of them mentioned it. Back inside, with the warmth of the house closing around her, and the sound of sleeping men, and the storm still raging beyond the walls, Clara went to the kitchen and stood at the counter and let the shaking come, because it always came after, and it was better to let it come in the kitchen alone than to fight it in front of people. Her hands shook on the counter edge. She breathed through it. She thought about the cow getting up. She thought about Nathan's hand on her arm and the way he had said "thanks to you" with an emphasis that sat differently from any compliment she had received since she'd arrived. She made herself a cup of tea. She sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight and she drank it slowly. The storm went on. It went on through the next day and into the following night. And during that time, Clara learned things about every person in that house that she could not have learned in a month of ordinary days, because ordinary days let people maintain the careful distances they preferred, and a storm that locked you together with 6 other people, and one set of supplies, and one fire, and no exit, had a way of burning those distances down to the ground. Billy Crane, she learned, was homesick in a way he hadn't admitted to anyone, including himself. Holt Dawes, behind the silence, carried a grief he had never put words to. She didn't know the shape of it, but she recognized the weight. The 3 other hands, Davy Marsh, Pete Aller, and a quiet, older man named Corbett, who everyone called Corb, were in their different ways. People who had come to this ranch because they needed a place as much as a job, which Clara understood better than most. And Mason Reed, who sat across the front room from her on the second evening, and looked at his hands for a long time, and then looked up and said, without preamble or softening, "I owe you something I don't know how to pay back." Clara looked at him. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "I do," he said. "I gave Nathan Hatch's information because I didn't have a choice, but I also gave you every hard time I could manage from the first day you walked in here because I didn't want to look at what it said about me, that Nathan needed you." He said it the way a man says something he has been building up to for several days, without flinching, that she respected. That wasn't right. "No," Clara agreed. "It wasn't. I thought you'd argue with me about it." "I'm not in the habit of arguing with people who are telling the truth," she said. Mason Reed was quiet. "I'm going to stay," he said, "if Nathan lets me, and I'm going to work the same way I've always worked. But I wanted you to know that I see what you've done here, what you've been doing since the first day." He paused. "I don't think a man in your situation would have gotten the same treatment. I think it was specifically because of what you looked like and where you came from and what you didn't have. And that—" He stopped. His jaw worked. That was wrong. Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said, "for saying it like that." He nodded. He looked back at his hands. She looked back at the fire. The next morning, the morning of the 3rd day, the wind dropped. Not the storm, not yet. But the wind eased enough that Nathan said they could check the full property, and he took Clara and Holt, and they went out together, moving through the aftermath of what the storm had done. The south fence was holding. The reinforced roof on the storage barn was holding. The cattle pens were intact. The water stores, all 100 gallons of them, were intact. They were walking back toward the house when Holt, who had gone ahead to check the north gate, came back with his face set in a way that immediately pulled Clara's attention. "Rider on the north road," he said. Nathan went still. "In this weather," he said. "Just one," Holt said. "Coming slow. He's not in a hurry." Nathan looked at Clara. She looked back at him. "Hatch doesn't wait for good weather," she said. Nathan's hands closed at his sides. "No," he said. "He wouldn't." He started walking toward the north gate. Clara went with him. The rider was Gerald Hatch, wearing his city coat and sitting his horse with the easy confidence of a man who believed that weather, like everything else, was a thing that happened to other people and could be managed by those with sufficient resources. He pulled up outside the gate and looked at the two of them standing there in the aftermath of the storm, and his eyes moved from Nathan to Clara, and back to Nathan, and his smile was the same smile it had been the last time, wide and prepared, and not quite reaching anything real. "Nathan," he said, "rough few days." "What do you want, Hatch?" Nathan said. The pleasantries fell away without resistance. "I heard your bunkhouse heating failed," Hatch said, "and that you had cattle losses." "One calf," Nathan said, "before the storm." "Still," Hatch said, "a ranch in your position can't absorb losses easily, and with winter just beginning." He let the sentence trail with the practiced air of a man who didn't need to finish it. "My position," Nathan said, "is that I own this land and I'm not selling it." Hatch looked at Clara. He looked at her the way he had looked at the house on his first visit, with the proprietorial assessment of a man who was already doing arithmetic. "Your cook did some shopping in town last week," he said pleasantly. "Traded preserved goods for medical supplies. People talk." "People do," Clara said. It was the first thing she had said, and Hatch's eyes sharpened at the sound of her voice. "You've been busy, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "for a woman in a borrowed situation." "I've been working," Clara said. "Which is what I was hired to do." Hatch looked at Nathan. "I've raised my offer," he said. "Substantially. Enough that you could clear your debts and start over somewhere with better odds." "I don't want to start over somewhere," Nathan said. "I want to run this ranch." "With what?" Hatch said, and for the first time the pleasantness cracked open and showed the edge underneath. "With a widow and 4 ranch hands and a bunkhouse that can't hold heat. Nathan, the next offer I make won't be as generous as this one. That's not a threat. That's arithmetic." "You've been running riders through my east pasture," Nathan said. The silence that followed was very brief but very complete. "I don't know what you mean," Hatch said. "You've been watching this ranch for months," Nathan said. "You found out about my finances through a man you leveraged with his own mistake. You've been stressing my cattle deliberately. You came here with a picture you built over a year, and you expected me to be desperate enough to fill in the frame the way you painted it." He took a step forward. "You were wrong about what you were looking at." Hatch looked at Clara again. Something moved in his expression that was not pleasantness and not threat, but something sharper than either the look of a man recalculating rapidly. "The widow," he said quietly. "The woman who runs this ranch," Nathan said. "Who I trust more than any person who has ever worked this land." The words hit the air and stayed there. Hatch sat his horse for a long moment. Then he gathered his reins. "My offer stands for 2 weeks," he said. After that, it doesn't matter," Nathan said. "The answer will be the same." Hatch looked at Clara one more time. His expression said he had underestimated something and knew it and was not yet ready to admit the full scope of it. Then he turned his horse. He rode back up the north road. Clara and Nathan stood at the gate and watched him go. When he was out of sight, Clara let out a long breath she hadn't known she was holding. "He's not done," she said. "No," Nathan agreed. "He's not done. He'll come back with something we haven't planned for." "Probably," Nathan said. He was quiet for a moment. "I meant what I said," he said. Clara kept her eyes on the road. "I know," she said. "The woman who runs this ranch," he said, not repeating it for emphasis, just saying it like a thing he wanted to hear out loud once more with no audience except the winter sky. Clara turned and looked at him. There was a long beat of silence between them that had a different quality from any silence they had shared before, not the silence of two people being careful, but the silence of two people who were standing very close to something they hadn't named, and both knew was there. Then Clara said, "We should get back. Breakfast needs to come off the fire in 10 minutes, or it'll be past saving." Nathan looked at her. "Right," he said. They walked back, and the storm behind them, finally breaking apart at the edges, let through the first pale light the ranch had seen in 3 days, thin and cold and tentative, but real. Clara felt it on her face and kept walking. There was still so much to do. There was always still so much to do, But for the first time since the wagon had rolled through the gate of Red Hollow Ranch, with all her grief and all her competence packed into one small suitcase, Clara Whitmore felt something that she had not let herself feel in a very long time. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Hatch's 2-week deadline sat on the ranch like a second storm. Nobody said it out loud at the breakfast table. Nobody put a number to the days. But everyone felt it the way you feel weather coming in before the sky shows it in the quality of the quiet, and the way people moved, and the conversations that stopped just short of where they needed to go. Clara felt it most in Nathan. He was not a man who showed worry easily. She had learned that about him across the weeks. He held things close, processed them internally, came out the other side with a decision already made and the emotional work already done, or at least tucked away, somewhere he could return to later. But since Hatch had ridden up the North Road with his raised offer and his 2-week window, Nathan had a quality of stillness to him that was different from his usual reserve. Tighter. Like a rope pulled to just before its breaking point. She watched him at supper that first evening after the storm broke, and she saw him eat half his food and push the rest around his plate, which was something she had never seen him do, and she filed it away without commenting on it. After the men went to the bunkhouse, Nathan stayed at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold in front of him. Clara washed the dishes. She waited. "He's going to come at us from a legal angle," Nathan said finally. "That's what I keep coming back to." Clara turned. "What makes you say that?" "Because he's already tried the financial pressure and it didn't work. He's tried the social leverage, Mason, and that's gone now." Nathan wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "Hatch is not the kind of man who runs out of approaches. He has money, and he has lawyers, and he has patience, and the one thing I've never looked at closely enough is whether the legal foundation of this property is as solid as I've always assumed." Clara dried her hands on her apron. She sat down across from him. "Tell me about the deed," she said. Nathan looked at her. "What do you know about property deeds?" he said. "More than you'd expect," Clara said. "My father was a county clerk in Ohio for 22 years. I grew up watching him read legal documents the way other people read newspapers. What do you know about the deed to this property?" Nathan was quiet for a moment. "My father filed the original claim in 1861, he said. He built the ranch. I inherited it when he died in 79. The deed transfer was handled by a lawyer in Cheyenne. Do you have the documents? In the office, in the strongbox. Have you looked at them recently?" "Not in years." Clara stood up. "Show me," she said. He looked at her for a moment, not the look of a man who doubted her, but the look of a man who was genuinely surprised that someone was asking to help with something he had assumed was his alone to carry. He got up. He led her to the office. The strongbox was in the lower drawer of the desk, and Nathan opened it with a key from his vest pocket and set the documents on the desk between them. Clara picked up the deed transfer from 1879 and read it with the slow, careful attention her father had taught her. Not reading for the words you expected to be there, but reading for the gaps, the imprecisions, the places where language that should have been exact had been allowed to be almost exact instead. She found it in 4 minutes. Her stomach dropped. She read it again. "Nathan," she said. Something in her voice made him lean over immediately. She pointed to the section. He read it. He read it again. "That's the east pasture boundary," he said slowly. "Yes," Clara said. "And the language here?" She pointed. "It says the eastern boundary of the claim is filed in 1861. But look at the 1861 filing." She found the earlier document and put it beside the transfer. The 1861 filing describes the eastern boundary using a creek marker. But this creek, she paused. Has the creek in the east pasture moved? Nathan went very still. "Creeks move," he said. The words came out slow, like he was thinking through something he didn't want to be thinking through. "They do," Clara said. "Over 15 years with heavy spring runoffs, a creek can shift its course by 20-30 yards. If your eastern boundary is legally defined by the creek's position, and the creek has moved, then my legal boundary has moved," Nathan said. And if someone were to file a counterclaim, Clara said carefully, arguing that the current position of the creek represents the legal boundary rather than the position at the time of the original filing. They could take the east pasture, Nathan said. The silence in the office was complete. That's where he's been running his riders, Clara said. He's not just been watching the cattle, he's been documenting, tracking the creek's current position, building a legal case that the eastern boundary of this property is 30 yards west of where you believe it to be. Nathan sat back in his chair. He put his hand over his face. Clara let him have a moment with it. Then she said, "How much of your cattle operation runs through the east pasture?" "The summer grazing rotation," Nathan said through his hand. "The primary water access for the south herd in dry months. He dropped his hand. "The creek itself. If he redraws the boundary to the creek's current position, I lose water access for 60% of my cattle in summer." "Which makes the ranch non-viable," Clara said. "Which makes the ranch non-viable," Nathan confirmed. He stared at the documents. "He doesn't need to buy it," he said. "He just needs to take the water and wait." "Yes," Clara said. Nathan looked at her. "How long do we have before he can file?" "I don't know enough about Wyoming territorial law to tell you that precisely," Clara said. "But I know that counterclaims require documentation, and documentation takes time to prepare, and lawyers take time to move." She paused. "What I know is that the first thing you need is your own lawyer, not in Cheyenne. Someone local who knows the county records and the history of this land." "Emmett Cross," Nathan said immediately. "He's in Millhaven, 20 miles. Can you get to him tomorrow? Roads may still be rough from the storm." "Nathan." Clara looked at him directly. "Can you get to him tomorrow?" He met her eyes. "Yes," he said. "I can get to him tomorrow." He left at dawn. He took Holt with him for the roads, and he left Mason in charge, and he told Clara, before he rode out, standing in the kitchen doorway in his heavy coat with his hat already on, "Don't let anything fall apart while I'm gone." Clara looked at him. "I haven't yet," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. He went. The day Nathan was gone was the day George Pelton came. Clara heard the horse in the yard at mid-morning and went to the door, expecting, she wasn't sure what she was expecting, some residue of Hatch in the back of her mind. But the man who climbed down from his horse was not Gerald Hatch. He was a smaller man, older, with a face that had been used hard by years of outdoor work, and a coat that had been mended so many times the original material was almost a minority of what it was made of now. He took his hat off when she opened the door. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm George Pelton. I have a small property downstream on the creek. I'm looking for Nathan Callahan." "Mr. Callahan is away today," Clara said. "I'm Clara Whitmore. I manage the house. Can I help you?" Pelton looked at her with the careful, measuring look of a man who had learned to assess situations quickly because he didn't have the resources to recover from misjudging them. "I heard some things about Gerald Hatch making offers on this property," he said. "I needed to speak to Nathan directly about what that would mean for my water access." Clara opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. "Have coffee. Tell me what you know." What George Pelton knew turned out to be considerable and considerably alarming. He sat across the kitchen table from Clara with his hat in his hands and his coffee going warm beside him, and he talked with the focused desperation of a man who had been holding something by himself for too long and had finally found someone willing to listen. Hatch had approached him too. 6 months ago. Not with an offer to buy Pelton's land wasn't what Hatch wanted, but with what Pelton described as a very polite, very detailed explanation of how his water access depended entirely on the goodwill of whoever owned Red Hollow Ranch, and how that goodwill under new ownership might look very different from what it currently was. "He was telling me," Pelton said, "without telling me that if he bought Nathan's ranch, I'd be paying him for water access that I've never had to pay for." "How many other downstream properties are there?" Clara asked. "4 that I know of," Pelton said. "The Harmon place, the Garrett widow, you may know her. I think she sold Nathan's cook some medical supplies." "I know her," Clara said. "The 2 Morrison brothers east of the creek bend." Pelton looked at his hat. None of us can survive without that water, and none of us have the resources to fight a man like Hatch in court." Clara was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Mr. Pelton," she said, "has Hatch approached any of the other downstream property owners the way he approached you?" "I believe so," Pelton said. "The Harmons told me they'd had a visit." "And did any of them document it?" "Keep notes of what was said." He looked at her. "I wrote down what he said to me," he said slowly, "that same evening, because it felt like the kind of thing you ought to write down." Clara leaned forward. "May I see what you wrote?" He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper that had clearly been handled many times. Clara read it. She read it twice. "Mr. Pelton," she said carefully, "what Hatch said to you, the way he connected his potential purchase of this property to your water access, that is not simply a polite warning. That is a threat. And if it was said the same way to the other downstream owners, you have documentation of a coordinated effort to coerce multiple property owners through the control of a shared resource." She set the paper down. "That's the kind of thing a lawyer might find very interesting." Pelton stared at her. "You think we could fight him?" he said. "I think Nathan is in Millhaven right now talking to a lawyer about the deed on this property." Clara said, "And I think when he comes back you should be here to talk to him, because what you have in your pocket and what Nathan is trying to protect may be two parts of the same defense." George Pelton sat in Clara's kitchen for 2 hours. She fed him lunch. She listened to everything he knew. She asked questions that were precise and practical, the way her father had always asked questions, the way of a person who understood that information was only useful if you knew what you were looking for. By the time Pelton's horse was saddled to leave, he had agreed to come back the next morning with every piece of paper he had, and to send word to the Harmons and the Garrett widow and the Morrison brothers, asking them to do the same. He paused at the door. "Ma'am," he said, "I came here expecting to talk to Nathan Callahan." He looked at her with the expression of a man who was revising something. "I think maybe I talked to the right person after all." Clara held the door. "Tell your wife I'll send over a jar of the preserved tomatoes," she said, "for the trouble of coming out in this weather." He put his hat on. He rode out. Clara stood in the kitchen and thought about 5 downstream families, and 1 creek, and 1 man with enough money to make everyone's life very small, and she thought about the piece of paper in George Pelton's coat pocket, and whether it was going to be enough. She didn't know, but she knew more than she had known this morning, and more was always somewhere to stand. Nathan came back in the late afternoon with Holt, and an expression on his face that Clara read before he had his coat off, tense, complicated, not entirely bad, but not good either. He sat at the kitchen table. She put coffee in front of him without being asked. "Emmett Cross says the creek boundary issue is real," Nathan said. "The language in the deed transfer is ambiguous enough that a counterclaim is possible. He thinks Hatch's lawyers have probably already identified it." "Has Hatch filed anything?" Clara said. "Not yet. But Cross says he's likely waiting for the 2-week window to close, giving me the deadline as cover, but actually using that time to finalize the legal paperwork. So when the deadline passes and I say no again, he files immediately, and I'm fighting it from behind." "Then we need to file first," Clara said. Nathan looked at her. "File what?" "A petition to clarify the boundary description," Clara said, "using the original 1861 filing and any survey records from that period. If you establish the historical boundary in court before he files his counterclaim, you're not defending, he's attacking an already stated legal position." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Cross said something similar," he said, "but it requires a survey, a historical survey to document where the creek was in 1861. He paused. "That takes time and money I'm not sure I have." "George Pelton was here today," Clara said. Nathan stopped. "Pelton," he repeated. "He has written documentation of Hatch threatening his water access," Clara said. "He believes the other downstream owners have had similar visits. If all 5 downstream properties file affidavits documenting Hatch's threats alongside your boundary petition, you're not just one rancher arguing a deed language question. You're a community of property owners documenting a systematic attempt to control regional water access through legal manipulation. She watched Nathan's face change as he followed the logic. That's a different kind of case, he said slowly. Yes, Clara said. It is. He looked at her across the kitchen table, and there was something in his expression that went past what she had seen from him before. Past the surprise and the reluctant respect and the careful warmth that had been building across the weeks. What was in his face now was something she had no simple name for. The look of a man who had been alone with something enormous for a very long time and had just realized in a concrete and undeniable way that he wasn't alone with it anymore. How did you think of this? He said. I grew up watching my father read documents, Clara said. And I've spent my adult life understanding that the people with money and lawyers don't always win if the people without money and lawyers have the truth on their side and know how to organize it. And George Pelton is willing to do this. He's coming back tomorrow morning with everything he has, Clara said. I told him to bring the others. Nathan was quiet. He looked at his coffee. He looked back at her. Clara, he said. She met his eyes. I don't know how to tell you what you... He stopped. He had the expression of a man who was not accustomed to searching for words and was finding the search harder than usual. I brought you here to cook, he said finally. I know, she said, and you have been... He gestured at something invisible that encompassed Clara, understood the last several weeks. You have been everything this ranch needed, and I didn't know I needed, and I... He stopped again. Clara looked at him quietly. You don't have to find a way to say it, she said. I know. He looked at her, and in the space between those two words and the way he was looking at her, something passed that was too large for the kitchen they were sitting in, and too real to pretend wasn't there. Then Clara stood up and went to the stove because the stew needed checking, and they were both people who understood that feelings that were real could be set down carefully and picked up again, and the work of keeping the ranch together was not finished and wouldn't be finished by anything that was said or not said at a kitchen table. But she felt his eyes on her back, and she didn't pretend she didn't. The next morning came with the particular clarity of air that follows a hard storm, cold and bright and precise, everything standing out with the high-definition quality of a world that had been scrubbed clean. George Pelton arrived at 8 with his wife, which Clara had not expected, and with a folder of papers that was more comprehensive than anything she had hoped for. Pelton's wife Ruth was a small, sharp-eyed woman who shook Clara's hand with a grip that said she had been waiting to talk to someone she could talk to. George told me what you said, Ruth said, about organizing the downstream owners. I talked to Mary Harmon last night and she's coming. And the Morrison brothers, Clara said. Jim Morrison is coming, Ruth said. Ed's got a sick horse, but he said to use anything he has. Clara set up the kitchen table as a workspace. It was an odd thing. 6 people ranged around a kitchen table in Wyoming, with coffee and documents, and the remains of breakfast talking about legal strategy that none of them were formally trained for, but all of them were practically educated in by the experience of trying to survive in a territory where money and influence moved like weather, and the only defense available to people without either was organization and truth and the willingness to show up. Nathan sat at the head of the table and listened, and occasionally spoke, and Clara moved between the stove and the table and kept the coffee coming, and kept the conversation focused when it started to drift, which it did several times into anger and fear, both of which were justified, and neither of which were useful in the current configuration. Mary Harmon had documentation, not as organized as Pelton's, but real a letter. Hatch's man had delivered to their property 6 months ago. That was on its face a courtesy notice about potential changes in water access arrangements in the region. But that read, when you understood the context, as a very clear message about what would happen to the Harmons if Red Hollow Ranch changed hands. The Morrison brother had a verbal account only, but he was willing to sign an affidavit. The Garrett widow, Betty Garrett, who had sold Clara the medical supplies, and who arrived at 10:30 with her coat buttoned wrong and a determination on her face that Clara immediately liked, had kept every piece of correspondence she had ever received from anyone, including a note from Hatch's lawyer that was in Betty's words, so polite it made my skin crawl. And that contained, buried in the second paragraph, a reference to the current water access arrangement's dependence on the continued cooperation of adjacent property owners. Which was, Clara thought, about as close to a legal threat as you could get, while still sounding like a letter about weather. By noon, they had a picture. It was organized on 3 sheets of paper that Clara had laid out on the table, timeline documentation witnesses, and when she stepped back and looked at it, she felt the particular cold satisfaction of a puzzle that had been unclear for a long time coming into resolution. "He's been doing this for over a year," she said. "Every approach, every visit, every letter, it's all part of the same strategy. He's been systematically documenting the vulnerabilities of each property, while simultaneously making sure each owner feels alone and isolated in their position." She looked around the table. "The reason it has worked so far is that none of you knew what was happening to the others." "Until now," Betty Garrett said. "Until now," Clara confirmed. Nathan looked at the 3 sheets of paper. He looked at Clara. "I'm taking this to Emmett Cross this afternoon," he said. "Take Pelton with you," Clara said. "Cross needs to meet the downstream owners. He needs to see that this isn't Nathan Callahan's problem, it's a regional problem with multiple documented victims. That changes the shape of the case." Nathan looked at Pelton. "Will you come?" he said. Pelton looked at his wife. Ruth Pelton looked at Clara. "Yes," she said in a tone that suggested her husband had not needed to be asked. The afternoon that Nathan and Pelton rode to Millhaven was the afternoon Mason Reed came to find Clara. She was in the storage barn taking a final post-storm inventory when she heard him come in, and she turned and saw him standing inside the door with his hat in his hands and the look of a man who has something to say that he has been building up to for several days. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Mason," she said. He turned his hat in his hands. "I had a conversation with Nathan yesterday evening," he said, "after you'd gone to bed." Clara waited. "He's letting me stay," Mason said. "He made his conditions clear. Transparent inventory process. Nothing goes through me without being checked by someone else. He said—" Mason stopped. His throat worked. "He said what I did was a betrayal, and it was, and he said he wasn't sure he'd ever fully trust me again the way he did before. And I understood that, and I told him I understood it, and then he said—" Another stop. "He said that he was keeping me on because loyalty counted for something even when it had holes in it, and because someone had reminded him that a man's worst choice didn't have to define the whole of him." Clara went back to her inventory list. "Good," she said. "He said it was you," Mason said. "Who told him that?" "I told him something like it," she said. "I don't remember the exact words." Mason was quiet for a moment. "Why?" he said. "After everything I said to you. Everything I did." Clara looked up from her list. She looked at him steadily. "Because this ranch needs you," she said, "and because you sat across a storage barn from me at 4 in the morning and told me the truth when you didn't have to, and you kept your word when you said you'd go to Nathan, and those things matter. They matter more than the things you got wrong." She held his gaze. "I meant what I said that night. You're not a bad man, Mason. You made bad decisions. That is not the same thing." Mason Reed stood there for a moment with his hat in his hands, and his eyes doing something that was controlled, but not entirely. He put his hat on. He nodded once. He went back to work. Clara turned back to her inventory. She counted. She wrote numbers down. She moved through the shelter barn with the lamp in her hand, and the cold at her back, and the particular quality of quiet that a ranch has when everything that needs to be held together is being held together, at least for now, at least for today. Nathan and Pelton came back from Millhaven at 6 in the evening. Clara knew from the way Nathan walked through the door, not the tight, contained walk of a man managing bad news, but the longer stride of a man who had put something down, that Emmett Cross had given them something to work with. He confirmed it over supper. Cross was filing the boundary clarification petition the following morning, citing the historical survey records from the county clerk's office and 3 affidavits from downstream property owners documenting Hatch's interference. He was also sending a letter to Hatch's lawyer, making clear that the downstream community was organized and documented and prepared to contest any counterclaim with collective testimony. He said, Nathan told the table, all of them, all 7 men and Clara, that the collective documentation changes the situation substantially. One rancher defending a deed question is manageable for someone with Hatch's resources. A coordinated group of property owners documenting a pattern of coercion is a different problem entirely. Harder to buy, harder to overwhelm, and considerably worse publicity for a man who is also trying to expand his interests in this county. Silence around the table. Then Billy Crane said, "So he might just back off. He might calculate that the cost of pushing forward is higher than the benefit," Nathan said. "Or he might get angry and push harder," Holt said. "He might," Nathan agreed. Mason Reed had been quiet through all of it. He looked at Clara. "What do you think he'll do?" he said. Every face at the table turned to her. Clara thought about Gerald Hatch on his horse in the cold after the storm, and the way his expression had shifted when Nathan said the words, "the woman who runs this ranch," and the particular quality of a man's pride when it has been surprised by something it didn't account for. "I think he'll try one more thing," she said. "Something direct. Something that bypasses the legal process because the legal process has gotten complicated." She paused. "I think he'll try to make this personal." Nathan looked at her. "Personal how?" "I don't know yet," she said. "But he looked at me on the North Road the way a man looks when he's identified where he thinks the weakness is." She met Nathan's eyes. "He thinks I'm the variable he didn't plan for. He's going to try to remove the variable." The table was very quiet. Nathan set his fork down. "Over my body," he said. It was very simply said. Not dramatic. Not performed. Just a fact offered in the same flat, certain tone he used for things like, "The fence needs repairing," and "The cattle need moving." Clara looked at him. She looked at the table around her. Mason with his complicated eyes. Billy, with his young face gone serious. Holt, steady as always. Corb and Pete and Davy, watching with the loyalty of men who had been fed and sheltered through a storm by a woman they had once expected to be gone in a week. She thought about Thomas, who had told her once near the end that the life she was going to have after him would be bigger than the one she'd had with him, and that he was sorry he wouldn't be there to see it, but that he wasn't worried because she was the most capable woman he had ever known, and the world was going to find that out eventually whether it was ready or not. She had not believed him when he said it. She was beginning to. "Thank you," she said, "to all of them, not just Nathan. To all of them." Billy Crane looked at his plate. "You're the one who ought to be thanked," he said. "Mrs. Whitmore." He paused. "Clara." Nobody corrected him. Holt Dawes said nothing, which was Holt's way of saying everything. Mason Reed looked at the table, and then looked up and met her eyes, and nodded once. The nod of a man making a private reaffirmation of something. Clara stood up. She started clearing plates. Outside, the Wyoming night was doing what Wyoming nights did in the deep of winter, going dark and vast and cold in a way that made the warmth of the house feel like something precious and deliberate and worth protecting. Inside that warmth at that table with those people, Clara Whitmore felt the full complex weight of where she was and what she had become to these people and what they had become to her, and she held it carefully, the way you hold something you know is real and don't want to drop. She carried the plates to the basin. She ran the water. She was halfway through the washing when she heard Nathan's chair push back from the table and his footsteps cross the kitchen floor and stop behind her. She didn't turn around. "You knew about the legal angle before I did," he said. "I suspected it," she said. "I wasn't certain until we looked at the documents. You organized the downstream owners. They were already looking for someone to organize them. Clara." His voice had the quality it got when he was done with the careful language and was saying the thing directly. "You have saved this ranch 3 times over. The supplies, the storm, and now this. And I need you to know that I am aware of that I see it. Not just what you've done, but what it cost you to come here and do it, and what you've had to prove and reprove every single day to people who should have seen it from the start." Clara kept her hands in the water. She was quiet for a long moment. "It's what I came here to do," she said. "No," Nathan said. "You came here to cook. What you've done is something else entirely." A pause. "Something I don't have adequate words for." She turned around. He was closer than he usually stood, the distance between them reduced to something that required a decision from both of them about whether to maintain it or close it. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Hatch is going to try something else," she said. "We should be ready." "I know," he said. "And you should get to bed. You've got an early ride tomorrow to check the north fence before the next cold front moves through." "I know that too," he said. He didn't move. "Nathan," she said quietly. "Clara," he said. He reached out. He put his hand very gently against her face, not pulling her toward him, not making a claim, just the deliberate placement of his hand against her cheek with a care that was almost painful in its restraint. She let it stay there, just for a moment, just long enough for both of them to know what it meant. Then she stepped back. "Good night," she said. He lowered his hand. Something in his expression settled. Not disappointment exactly, but the particular look of a man who understood that what had just passed between them was real and was going to require time, and that time was something he was willing to give. "Good night, Clara," he said. He went. She turned back to the dishes. Her hands were very steady. Her heart was not. But that was all right. Her heart hadn't been entirely her own for a while now, and she was beginning to think that wasn't something to be afraid of. Outside, the night went on being enormous and cold and full of stars that didn't know or care about Gerald Hatch or water rights or legal petitions. And Red Hollow Ranch sat under all that sky with its repaired fences and its full stores, and its people safe inside it. And Clara Whitmore stood at the kitchen basin and washed the last of the dishes and thought about what Nathan had said. "I see it. Not just what you've done, but what it cost you." She had been seen. After 32 years of being looked at and not seen, of being assessed by the surface and found wanting before the interior was ever considered, she had been seen by a man who had started from the same place everyone else had and arrived somewhere different, and the journey he had made to get there had been visible to her at every step, which made it matter in a way that effortless acceptance never could have. She wrung out the washcloth. She hung it over the basin edge. She blew out the lamp. In the dark, she allowed herself 1 full minute of feeling everything: the fear about what Hatch was going to do, the uncertainty about what came next, the warmth of Nathan's hand against her face, and the knowledge that that warmth was real, and then she breathed out and let it settle into the part of herself where she kept the things that were too important to examine too frequently. Tomorrow would come. Hatch would make his next move, and she would be ready. She always was. Hatch moved on a Tuesday. Clara knew it was coming. She had said so, and she had meant it, and she had spent the days since their confrontation at the North Gate, watching the road and thinking about the shape of a man who had been outmaneuvered, and how such a man chooses to respond when his patience has run out, and his careful strategy has been turned against him. She had expected something legal. Another filing, another letter, some procedural maneuver through Emmett Cross that would require Nathan to spend money he didn't have, defending ground he'd already defended twice. She had not expected what actually came. She was in the kitchen at 7 in the morning when Mason Reed came through the back door fast, which was not a thing Mason did. Mason moved with the deliberate economy of a man who had decided long ago that urgency was a thing to be managed rather than displayed. "Rider from town," Mason said. "Betty Garrett's boy. He's outside." Clara was already moving to the door. The boy was 14, red-faced from the cold, his horse still blowing from a hard ride. He had a piece of paper in his hand that he held out to Clara before she had fully stepped off the porch. She took it. She read it. She read it again. "Get Nathan," she said to Mason. Mason looked at her face. He went without asking what was on the paper. Clara stood on the porch with Betty Garrett's boy shifting from foot to foot in front of her, and she read the paper a third time, because she wanted to be absolutely certain she was reading it correctly and not constructing a disaster from something smaller. She was reading it correctly. Nathan came out in his coat with it half-buttoned, which told her Mason had communicated the urgency. She handed him the paper. He read it. His face went very still. He filed a petition of abandonment, Nathan said. Against the Pelton property, Clara said. Not yours, Pelton's. Nathan looked up. If the Pelton property is declared abandoned, it reverts to territorial claim, Clara said, which Hatch has already filed for. Pelton's land borders your east pasture. If Hatch acquires it, the boundary dispute on your eastern line becomes a boundary dispute with an adjacent property owner who has full legal standing, not a counterclaim based on a creek's position, but a direct property line challenge from a neighbor. He doesn't need the creek argument anymore, Nathan said slowly. The creek argument was always a backup, Clara said. This was the plan. This was always the plan. He let us organize the downstream owners and file the boundary clarification because he knew we would, because he wanted us to feel like we'd won something while he quietly moved on the Pelton property from a completely different direction. Nathan stared at the paper. George Pelton hasn't abandoned that land, he said. He's been there 20 years. He hasn't filed proof of continuous improvement in 11 months, Clara said. The territorial abandonment statute requires annual documentation. Hatch found the gap. Nathan's jaw was hard. Can Pelton file retroactively? I don't know, Clara said. That's the first question for Emmett Cross. She paused. But I think there's something else. Something faster. He looked at her. What? Get me to the Pelton place, she said, right now before this paper is formally served. I need to see what documentation George Pelton actually has. Nathan had the horses saddled in 8 minutes. It was the fastest Clara had ever seen the ranch move for a non-emergency, and she understood feeling the controlled urgency in the air that the men of Red Hollow Ranch had made a quiet collective decision somewhere between the storm and the kitchen table, and this morning that Clara Whitmore's word was a thing you acted on. She rode with Nathan and Mason, and the cold came at them off the mountain with a particular sharpness, and Clara rode with her coat buttoned to the throat, and her mind running ahead of the horse, working through the problem with the same methodical focus she brought to everything, not panicking, not spiraling, just thinking. Ruth Pelton met them at the door. She took one look at Nathan's face and stood back to let them in. George Pelton was at the table with his coffee, and he went white when Nathan put the paper in front of him. That's not possible, he said. The annual documentation, Clara said, sitting down across from him. The improvement filing. When did you last file it? Pelton's face went through several stages. January, he said. Last January. I always file in January. Last January is 13 months ago, Clara said. The statute requires filing within 12 months. Pelton stared at her. I missed it by 1 month, he said. Yes. 1 month, he said again. The words had the quality of a man watching something enormous happen from a very short distance. Clara leaned forward. George, do you have receipts? Bills of sale records of any work done on this property in the last 13 months? Any improvements at all? Repairs, purchases, additions to the livestock? Ruth was already moving. She went to the back room with the speed of a woman who knew exactly where things were, and she came back with a wooden box that she set on the table in front of Clara and opened without ceremony. Inside was a paper record that was on its surface, disorganized receipts, notes, scraps of calculations, a small ledger that had been added to in handwriting that changed with the available light and the urgency of the moment. But it was there. All of it was there. Clara started going through it. She moved fast, sorting with her hands and her eyes simultaneously, and the room was quiet, except for the sound of paper and the fire and Ruth Pelton's careful breathing. March, Clara said. New fence posts on the north boundary. Here's the receipt from the hardware in Millhaven. She set it aside. May, additional livestock. 4 head purchased from the Morrison brothers. Bill of sale. She set that aside. July, roof repair on the outbuilding. Materials purchased here and labor. She looked up at George. Did you do the labor yourself or hire it out? Myself, he said. Do you have a neighbor who saw you doing it? Corbett helped me for 2 days, Pelton said. Nathan said Corb. Yes, Clara said. She turned back to the box. That's 3 documented improvements in the last 13 months on your property, George. The abandonment statute requires a showing of continuous use, not annual filing. The annual filing is the standard method, but continuous use documentation is an alternative basis. She looked at Nathan. This needs to be in front of Emmett Cross by noon. Nathan was already standing. Can you put those documents in order? He said to Clara. Give me 20 minutes, she said. She had them in order in 15. She organized them into 3 categories: physical improvements, livestock additions, third-party witnesses, and wrote a 1-page summary at the top in the clear, precise hand her father had taught her, and that she had used to keep household accounts for 11 years. She handed the stack to Nathan. He took it and looked at it, and then looked at her. You wrote a legal brief, he said. I wrote a summary, she said. Cross will know what to do with it. Nathan rode for Millhaven. Mason stayed with the Peltons. Clara rode back to the ranch alone, which was the first time she had ridden alone since arriving, and the cold and the silence of the land were both very large around her, and she let herself feel the full weight of the morning without trying to manage it, because some things needed to be felt in order to be put down properly. She thought about 1 month. George Pelton had missed his filing by 1 month. She thought about how Hatch had found that, how long he had been waiting for it, how he had let the downstream organization happen and the boundary petition happen, and had watched all of it with the patience of a man who was playing a longer game than anyone realized holding this card, until the moment when everything else on the table suggested he'd lost. She thought about how close it had come, how close it was still coming, because the legal situation was not resolved. And Emmett Cross was good. But he was one lawyer in a small Wyoming town, and Hatch had resources that could bury a local attorney in procedural filings for months. She thought about Thomas, who had said she was capable, and about the first morning at Red Hollow Ranch, when she had stood in the kitchen and given herself 3 minutes to feel the grief, and then tied on her apron and gotten to work. And she thought, riding through the cold, that the thing she had learned in all the hard years was not that strength was the absence of fear. It was that strength was what you did while the fear was happening. It was the apron you tied on anyway. It was the paper you organized by lamplight. It was the rope you picked up, and the storm you walked into, and the lawyer you got to by noon. It was showing up, over and over and over, even when no one expected you to, especially then. She rode into the yard at Red Hollow Ranch, and Holt Dawes took her horse without being asked, and Billy Crane was on the porch and looked at her face with the particular attention of someone who had been waiting and was trying to read the outcome before it was spoken. Well, he said. We're fighting it, Clara said. Billy nodded like that was the answer he expected and the only one he would have accepted. She went inside and made lunch. Emmett Cross filed the continuous use documentation by 2 in the afternoon. Nathan sent word by rider, and the word reached Red Hollow Ranch at 4, and Clara was in the kitchen when Mason Reed came in with the note and read it out loud, and the room Billy and Holt and Corb and the others received it with the particular exhale of people who have been holding their breath for a long time. Does it mean Hatch's petition fails? Billy asked. It means there's a legal question now instead of a default, Clara said. Hatch filed on the basis that Pelton had no documentation. Now Pelton has documentation. A judge has to decide which argument holds. And the judge will decide for us. The judge will decide for the facts, Clara said. Which is why the facts matter. Nathan came home at 6. He came in through the back door and stood in the kitchen and looked at Clara. And his face had the specific exhaustion of a man who had been running on controlled adrenaline for 12 hours and had just allowed himself to stop. Cross is confident, he said. That's something, she said. He says the continuous use argument is solid. The documentation you organized is... He paused. He used the word exceptional. His words, not mine. The documentation was George Pelton's, Clara said. I just put it in the right order. Clara, Nathan said. She turned from the stove. You know what you did today, he said. Don't pretend otherwise. She held his gaze. It's not resolved yet, she said. No, he agreed. But it will be. He said it with a certainty that was not bravado. The certainty of a man who had looked at the situation clearly and made an assessment and was not in the habit of being wrong about things he had looked at clearly. Clara turned back to the stove. Wash up, she said. Supper in 20 minutes. He went, and Clara stood at the stove and stirred the pot and let herself for just one moment feel the fullness of what this day had been and what had been prevented and what was still possible, and it was a lot to hold all at once. The fear and the relief and the warmth of a house full of people who had become without her, entirely intending it the closest thing to family she had known since Thomas died. She stirred the pot. She added salt. She called them all in to eat. 3 weeks later, the territorial judge ruled in favor of George Pelton. The continuous use documentation was sufficient. The abandonment petition was denied. Hatch's alternative approach to the boundary dispute, the one that would have put him on Pelton's land with legal standing, to challenge Nathan's east pasture line, was closed. Nathan received the news by letter, and he read it at the breakfast table, and he set it down in the middle of the table and looked around at the faces of the people who had been with him through all of it, and he didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "It's over." Billy Crane let out a sound that was not quite a word. Holt Dawes looked at the table with an expression that for Holt was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Mason Reed closed his eyes for just a second. Clara was at the stove. She did not turn around immediately. She let the moment be what it was for everyone else, and she let herself feel it quietly, without making herself the center of it, because that had never been what she came here for. Then Nathan said her name. Just her name. She turned. He was looking at her from the head of the table with the letter in his hand, and the full open expression of a man who was not managing anything in this moment, and not performing anything, and not keeping anything at careful distance, just looking at her. "Come sit down," he said. She untied her apron. She sat at the table. Nathan looked around at all of them one more time, and then he looked at her. "This ranch exists because of the people at this table," he said. "All of them, every single one." He paused. "And it exists because one woman came here in October with one suitcase and no welcome and decided to save it anyway before anyone asked her to and before anyone believed she could." The kitchen was very quiet. Clara looked at her hands. "I want everyone to know," Nathan said, "that Clara Whitmore is not the cook at Red Hollow Ranch." He waited for her to look up. She did. "She is the reason there is a Red Hollow Ranch," he said, "and I intend to spend a considerable amount of time making sure she understands exactly what that means to me." Billy Crane made a noise that was definitely not a word. Holt Dawes looked at the ceiling. Mason Reed looked at the table with the ghost of something on his face that if you had told him a month ago he would feel for the widow from Missouri, he would have denied to his last breath. Clara looked at Nathan. She said, "You're embarrassing yourself." "Probably," he agreed, "in front of your entire crew." "Yes. They're all going to remember this." "I'm counting on it," he said. She held his gaze. The warmth in his eyes was not a new thing. She had been watching it build across the months, the way you watch a fire catch from the first uncertain spark, to the point where there was no question anymore about whether it was going to take. But it was the first time he had let it be entirely visible, with no management at all, in front of every person on the ranch, with nothing between it and the air. "All right," she said. It was 2 words. But the way she said them quietly with her eyes on his and her hands still on the table, and a steadiness that came from somewhere deep, carried everything that didn't need to be spoken, all the weeks and all the mornings and all the work and all the cold, and all the things that had been set down carefully and picked up again. Billy Crane looked at Holt. Holt looked at Mason. Mason stood up and picked up his plate. "I reckon," Mason said in the tone of a man addressing the table at large, "that some of us have fence work to attend to." There was a general movement of men finding reasons to be elsewhere. That was the most tactful thing Clara had ever witnessed from a group of ranch hands. And she would have laughed except that Nathan was still looking at her from across the table, and the moment was too real for laughter. When the kitchen was empty of everyone but the two of them, the quiet that settled was the good kind. The kind with warmth in it rather than distance. "Hatch will try again," Clara said. "Not here maybe, but somewhere." "Probably," Nathan said. "Men like that don't stop." "What will you do?" "Watch. Document. Stay organized." He paused. "We know how to do it now." "We." The word sat between them with its full meaning intact. Clara picked up her apron from where she'd set it on the table. She didn't put it on. She held it in her hands. "I want to stay," she said. "I want you to know that. Not because I need a place I could find another place now, but because this—" She looked around the kitchen, then back at him. "This is where I'm supposed to be." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I've known it for a while." "I'm not easy," she said. "I'm opinionated and I read legal documents for pleasure, and I'll rearrange your storage barn without asking." "You've been doing that since the second day," he said, "and I'm going to keep doing it." "Clara," he said. "What?" "I'm not asking you to be easy," he said. "I'm asking you to stay." She looked at him. He looked at her. "I'll stay," she said. He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers, both of them hers, and the apron she was holding, and he held them with the same deliberate care he had put into everything she had seen him do. The care of a man who understood that the things worth having were the things you didn't rush and didn't take lightly and didn't let go of once you had them. They sat there for a moment. Just that. Just the warmth of his hand over hers, and the quiet kitchen, and the winter light coming through the window, and the sound of the ranch outside going about its work, the way it did, the way it would keep doing, because the people who held it together were still here. Spring came to Red Hollow Ranch, the way it always came to Wyoming. Slowly, then suddenly the cold breaking apart over the course of 2 weeks, into something that was almost warmth, then warmth itself, tentative and real. The east pasture greened first. The creek that had been the center of so much danger ran clear and cold through the thawed ground. And George Pelton rode over on the first warm day to look at it with Nathan. And the two men stood at the bank and talked about water and land and what it cost to hold on to both. And when Pelton looked up and saw Clara coming across the pasture with a basket of food for the noon meal, he took his hat off and held it to his chest. "Ma'am," he said. Clara set the basket down on the fence post. "Mrs. Pelton sent these back," she said, and produced 4 jars of Ruth Pelton's preserved peaches, which were by Clara's assessment better than anything she had put up herself, and she was not too proud to say so. The cattle in the east pasture were fat and unbothered. The fence lines held. The storage barn roof reinforced before the storm had come through the winter, without a single failure. Billy Crane had started asking Clara about cooking in a way that had quietly shifted from curiosity to something more like apprenticeship, and she had started teaching him because she believed that knowledge was only as good as its ability to move from one person to the next, and because Billy Crane had the natural instinct for it that could not be taught, only encouraged. Holt Dawes had started nodding at Clara when he passed her in the yard, instead of simply not acknowledging her existence, which for Holt was the social equivalent of a lengthy warm speech. Mason Reed had taken over the supply inventory with the meticulous precision of a man who had decided that if he was going to do a thing, he was going to do it so well that no one would ever have reason to question it again. And Clara checked his numbers every week, and they were always right. And once she told him so, and he said, "I know," in a tone that was not arrogant, but was no longer apologetic either, and she thought that was probably the right place for him to land. The Harmons and the Morrisons and Betty Garrett and the Peltons had formed without formally naming it, the kind of loose cooperative that frontier communities assembled when they understood that the only reliable defense against the people who wanted to take things was the act of watching out for each other. They shared information about Hatch's movements. He had turned his attention to a property 2 counties west, which was either a retreat or a repositioning, and probably both. And they filed their annual improvement documentation on time, every one of them, and they knew each other's names now, which they hadn't before. And Clara thought that was the most lasting thing that had come out of all of it. People who knew each other's names were harder to isolate. Hatch had built his strategy on isolation. They had dismantled it by introducing themselves. On the first truly warm evening of spring, Nathan built a fire in the yard. Not for warmth, but for the simple reason that it was the first evening warm enough to sit outside, and the whole crew came out, and Betty Garrett rode over with her son, and the Peltons came, and Ruth brought the preserved peaches that turned out to be even better heated up. And Billy Crane produced a harmonica that no one knew he had, and Holt Dawes sat at the edge of the firelight and looked slightly less solemn than usual, which everyone accepted as festive. Mason Reed sat across the fire from Clara and raised his cup to her in the particular way of a man who has made his peace with something and intends to demonstrate it without fuss. She raised hers back. Nathan sat beside her, not performing adjacency, just close the natural closeness of two people who had stopped managing the distance between them. At some point in the evening, Betty Garrett leaned over and said quietly to Clara, "They said you wouldn't last a week." "They did," Clara confirmed. "Who's they?" Betty said. Clara looked around the fire. Mason with his cup raised, Billy with his harmonica, Holt with his less solemn face, Corb and Pete and Davy and the Peltons and the Harmons and all of it. All of this grown from nothing, from a wagon rolling into a yard full of skepticism and one woman who had decided not to ask for belief, but simply to be worth it. "Everyone," she said, at first. Betty Garrett looked at her. "What do you think about that now?" Clara thought about the calf she hadn't been able to save, and the water she had stored, and the fence she had noticed, and the document she had organized, and the hand she had held against a frightened cow in a snowstorm, and the paper she had read in the lamplight at 4 a.m, and the kitchen table full of people who needed the information she had found. And all of it, the full weight of it, what it had cost and what it had built. "I think," Clara said, "that the people who say a thing like that aren't really talking about the person they're looking at." Betty raised an eyebrow. "They're talking about what they believe is possible," Clara said. And sometimes those two things, what they believe and what's actually true, are so far apart from each other that the only way to close the gap is to just go ahead and do the thing and let the doing answer for itself. Betty Garrett looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "I wish I'd known you 20 years ago." Clara smiled. "I wasn't ready 20 years ago," she said. "I'm ready now." Nathan beside her heard both of those sentences. He didn't say anything. He put his hand over hers in the firelight, the same way he had put it over her hands in the kitchen on the day the letter came, with the same deliberate and unhurried care, and she turned her hand under his and held it. The fire went on burning. Billy Crane played something on the harmonica that wasn't a song anyone could name, but that had the quality of the kind of music that belonged to places like this, wide and uncomplicated and honestly felt. The stars over Wyoming came out in their numbers. And Red Hollow Ranch, which had been failing when a widow arrived from Missouri in October with one suitcase and a grief she hadn't yet found the bottom of, sat under that enormous sky with its full stores, and its sound fences, and its clear-running creek, and its people who knew each other's names, held together by the accumulated weight of one woman's competence and courage and the refusal, quiet and absolute, to be less than she was, because no one had thought to expect more. They had said she wouldn't last a week. She had lasted the winter. She had done more than last. She had taken a ranch that was dying by degrees, and a community that was being picked apart by isolation, and a man who had forgotten that strength was allowed to ask for help. And she had held all of it in her capable hands and refused to drop any of it. Not once. Not even when the storm was at its worst and the legal threat was at its closest, and the loneliness of being seen as less than you were pressed in from every direction. Clara Whitmore had not come to Red Hollow Ranch to survive it. She had come, though she hadn't known it, when she climbed off that wagon with her one suitcase and her tired eyes, to become what it needed. And what it needed, it turned out, was exactly her. Not a different version of her, not a smaller or quieter or more easily accepted version. Not a woman who fit the shape of what people expected when they looked at her and made their fast and careless rulings. Her, all of her. The grief and the competence and the stubbornness and the capacity to read a room and a legal document and a frightened animal with equal precision. The ability to give 3 minutes to grief and then tie on the apron and get back to work. The willingness to go into the storm on a rope tied around her waist because the work required it and the work was what she had. All of that, every bit. The people who had laughed the first day would remember for the rest of their lives that they had laughed. Not because Clara reminded them of it, but because the truth had a way of staying visible once it had been established, and what Clara had established at Red Hollow Ranch was the kind of truth that didn't need to be argued. It simply was. The fire burned down slowly. The evening moved toward night, and Clara Whitmore, who had arrived with nothing but what she carried inside her, sat beside the man who had seen her clearly and held his hand in the firelight, and she was home. Not the home she had lost. Something better. The home she had built herself, with her own hands out of the hardest materials available. Doubt and grief and hard weather, and the long grinding work of proving that what you are is not decided by who first looked at you and found you wanting, but by what you do with every morning that comes after. That was the truth of her. That was the truth they hadn't expected. That was the truth that saved them all.